Establishing central influence, the pawn pushes forward, aiming to restrict black's development and dictate the game's rhythm. Developing this knight immediately challenges central control and prepares for rapid kingside expansion. Claiming central space and preparing to challenge black's knight's influence. Embracing the fianchetto, black prepares to eye the long diagonal, a strategic choice that shapes the ensuing pawn structure and potential king safety. Developing a knight to its most natural outpost now challenges black's fianchetto formation and prepares to seize central space. Developing the bishop to its natural diagonal immediately supports the central pawn structure and prepares for castling. Dominating the center, white boldly claims more space and prepares for kingside pressure. Opening the d-file for potential piece pressure, this pawn advance also prepares for development on the queen side. Solidifying the center and preparing kingside castling, this develops a piece harmoniously while setting the stage for further central control. Securing the monarch behind a pawn shield is a classic defensive maneuver, allowing piece development to flow more freely. Securing the central pawn's stability and preparing for an eventual kingside pawn storm, white neatly positions his knight for further development, eyeing squares that will prove crucial for pawn breakthroughs and potential tactical skirmishes. Boldly challenging white's central pawn formation, this pawn thrust instantly ignites a dynamic struggle for control of the critical e5 square and opens crucial diagonals for black's pieces. Securing the monarch amidst the burgeoning central battlefield demonstrates a keen understanding of the king's safety as the pawn structure solidifies, anticipating potential counterplay and preparing for a more active middle game engagement. Solidifying the center and preparing for queenside expansion, this development neatly links pieces and primes the knight for potential advances into enemy territory, simultaneously deterring white's immediate pawn pushes. Developing the bishop here solidifies the e4 pawn and prepares for central pawn pushes, while also subtly eyeing the queenside and a potential later advance of the d-pawn. Immediately confronting white's knight on f3, black aims to disrupt white's harmonious development and potentially create tactical skirmishes on the kingside, seeking to exploit any awkwardness in white's knight placement. Unleashing pressure, white immediately challenges the misplaced knight, forcing black to address this awkward piece before it can be further supported or exchanged. This aggressive probing aims to disrupt black's harmonious development and potentially create weaknesses around the kingside. The bishop's new outpost on g5 injects immediate tension, questioning the soundness of black's king's safety. Recognizing the threat on the f3 knight, black gracefully retreats the bishop, reinforcing the kingside's defensive structure and preparing to contest the open central files, all while subtly repositioning for potential counterplay on the queen side. Sacrificing the bishop for the knight fundamentally alters the pawn structure on the kingside, opening a diagonal and potentially creating weaknesses around black's king. This exchange, while seemingly giving up material, aims to disrupt black's pawn shield and activate white's remaining pieces for a targeted assault. It's a calculated risk, trading one positional advantage for potential tactical firepower. Reclaiming the piece restores balance, but look at the weakened dark squares around your king now, a potential future target. Pioneering the central pawn thrust here initiates a strategic pawn chain that will relentlessly push black's pieces back and claim more territory. This action also opens the d-file for white's queen and rook, potentially creating future attacking avenues. Clearing the path for the knight's return to the center, this maneuver sets the stage for potential pawn breaks and aims to improve its defensive coverage of the queen side. Repositioning the knight to e1 is a subtle but important shift, aiming to reinforce the kingside and potentially reroute the knight towards the f3 square, opening up a path for the queen to join the attack or for the f-pawn to advance. It's about building pressure indirectly, anticipating black's somewhat cramped position, and looking for ways to exploit the slightly passive nature of the dark-squared bishop. This maneuver might also be preparing to activate the kingside pawns, creating potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure if not addressed carefully. The knight's repositioning to d7 aims to prepare for a future kingside advance, potentially involving the f-pawn, while also offering defensive support. This maneuver acknowledges the space white has consolidated in the center and seeks to outflank it, rather than directly confronting the e4 pawn. It's a patient approach, weaving a subtle threat into the fabric of the position, suggesting that the central pawn chain, while seemingly solid, could become a target for black's coordinated pieces. The knight's journey, though appearing circuitous, serves a greater purpose in enhancing black's attacking potential and preparing for a more dynamic phase of the game. Strategically repositioning the knight to d3 aims to bolster the queenside, perhaps preparing a pawn push like c5 or a knight transfer to f4 to pressure the kingside. A bold attempt to shatter white's central control and inject chaos into the position. This thrust aims to unbalance the pawn structure and create dynamic counterplay on the kingside. Opening the e-file with this capture is a calculated risk, introducing immediate complications and forcing black to confront the newly exposed king's diagonal. Opening the kingside g-file grants black immediate attacking potential against white's castled monarch, though it also creates a permanent weakness on the kingside dark squares that white will certainly try to exploit. Opening the f-file promises dynamic play, aiming to exploit black's slightly weakened kingside pawn structure and the potential for white's pieces to infiltrate through this newly created avenue. This brings the knight back into the fray, aiming to challenge white's centralized pieces and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares around white's king. Black's maneuver initiates a dynamic struggle for control of the kingside, as the knight now eyes the f4 pawn and the prospect of further kingside pawn advances, aiming to open lines against the castled monarch. It's a bid to activate a somewhat passive piece and rejoin the fight for central influence. Suddenly, the queen hops to d2, aiming to bolster the king's defense while eyeing the kingside, a subtle shift from immediate kingside aggression to a more measured approach. Initiating a subtle repositioning, the rook embarks on a journey to the central file, preparing to contest it or support potential pawn advances while simultaneously reinforcing the kingside defenses. Unlocking the d-file with this exchange immediately sharpens the battle, forcing a reassessment of black's somewhat passive pawn structure and offering white a chance to activate the rook. The immediate consequence is a potential open highway for white's remaining pieces, while black must carefully consider how to defend the now more vulnerable kingside. The knight on g6, previously a solid defender, might find itself out of position as the pawn chain breaks down. This aggressive pawn break signals white's intent to seize the initiative and exploit any lingering weaknesses in black's setup. Reclaiming the center and developing immediate attacking pressure, this recapture instigates a dynamic shift, preparing to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the kingside. Opening a crucial central file, this exchange aims to simplify the position and potentially exploit the newly freed diagonal for white's queen. Black must now carefully consider whether to recapture with the knight, further opening lines, or employ a pawn, preserving some central pawn structure but potentially delaying piece development. The resulting pawn structure will heavily influence the middle game, possibly leading to a strategic battle for control of the open e-file or creating weaknesses in black's kingside, if not handled precisely. Reclaiming that pawn with the rook untangles black's pieces and begins to contest the central files, potentially opening up avenues for counterplay on the kingside after the pawn structure on the f-file is resolved. Aggressively probing the queenside, white aims to exploit the slightly awkward placement of black's knight on e7 and potentially create weaknesses around the enemy king, all while subtly building pressure on the b-file. Bringing the bishop to d7 aims to shore up the queenside pawn chain and potentially prepare for a later c6 to solidify the center, while also activating the piece on a diagonal that might become relevant if white commits to pushing the b-pawn. Unlocking the kingside initiative by repositioning the bishop to d3 aims to pressure the weakened f5 pawn and potentially create mating threats along the kingside diagonals, while simultaneously preparing for future pawn breaks. Opening a diagonal for the rook to potentially swing to the kingside. Opening up the c-file for potential future pressure, white secures a central pawn majority after the exchange, potentially simplifying towards a favorable endgame if black isn't careful about king's safety. Unlocking the queenside pawn structure and preparing to contest the open c-file demonstrates a clear intent to create counterplay. Reasserting pressure on the queenside, the white queen eyes the pawn structure, preparing to exploit any weaknesses that arise from black's somewhat disjointed pieces. Unleashing an aggressive pawn thrust, black seeks to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and create open lines for counterplay, aiming to exploit the weakness created by white's capture on e5. Sacrificing the bishop here looks like an attempt to disrupt black's kingside pawn structure and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares around the enemy monarch. The intent seems to be to create immediate complications, forcing black to make difficult decisions about their pawn formation and expose their king to greater danger, even if it means temporarily giving up material for initiative. Opening a crucial file for the rook, this recaptures material but at the cost of creating a pawn weakness. Seizing the exposed king is paramount now. White's queen aggressively penetrates the enemy's territory, transforming a positional advantage into a direct threat. Reclaiming the open file offers a crucial counterplay, allowing the rook to become an active participant in the struggle for central influence after its previous passive positioning. This repositioning of the rook to the central file aims to apply pressure along that important pathway, potentially supporting pawn advances or preparing for future exchanges that could weaken black's pawn structure. Seeking to consolidate pieces and establish control over the f-file, this maneuver aims to prepare for a potential breakthrough or reposition the queen for an offensive role. Securing the king's immediate perimeter and preventing any audacious knight or bishop incursions towards the g2 square is the primary aim here. Reawakening the queen's battery on the e-file, this maneuver aggressively targets white's king and creates immediate pressure, potentially forcing concessions and complicating white's king's safety. Reclaiming the open file, this repositions the rook to a more active square, aiming to contest the pressure black's rook currently exerts on the 7th rank and prepare for potential advances along that vital horizontal. The rook's maneuver to the 4th rank fundamentally shifts the dynamic, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated pieces by offering an exchange that, if accepted, would open lines for black's active pieces and potentially create a passed pawn on the queen side. Re-establishing the queen's influence on the central ranks, this maneuver aims to dislodge black's forwardly placed rook and reclaim the initiative on the open files. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure with this advance aims to prevent white's knight from gaining a foothold on c5 or b4 while potentially preparing a queenside expansion later, though it does concede some central space and potentially weakens the b6 pawn long-term. Stabilizing the queenside pawn structure and preparing to contest the open b-file. The rook's redeployment to the 5th rank signals an immediate intention to exploit the open e-file, potentially pinning the white queen against the back rank or creating infiltration threats. Seizing the initiative, white forcefully targets the pinned knight, forcing black to make a difficult decision about defending their crucial outpost. Swapping queens here significantly alters the endgame landscape. Black's initiative now hinges on activating their pieces around the isolated pawn and exploiting the open files that will soon materialize. Rook activity is paramount now. Placing the rook on the open file forces black to confront its imposing presence and potentially resolve the quandary of the doubled pawns. The king ventures into the open, seeking activity and potentially bolstering the remaining pawn structure in this endgame, though it does expose him to potential checks down the g-file should white's rook find its way there. A patient regrouping maneuver, repositioning the rook to a more active diagonal, aiming to support a potential pawn push or to prepare for a future piece exchange, while also keeping an eye on the king side. Shifting the king towards the queen side, the monarch seeks sanctuary from the lingering rook pressure while preparing for potential pawn advances on the queen side, aiming to create a more active defensive structure as the material dwindles. Securing the king's immediate safety by stepping back from the diagonal attack is a pragmatic choice, acknowledging the potential for disruption as the game progresses towards simplification. Challenging the very structure of white's queen side, This maneuver forces a difficult decision regarding pawn integrity and potential weaknesses. An attempt to seize the open c-file, potentially forcing concessions from black's slightly awkward rook placement, though it risks leaving the rook isolated for the moment. Trading the last of the heavy pieces eliminates immediate mating threats and ushers in an endgame where black's doubled pawns on the h-file become a significant positional weakness for white to exploit. Re-establishing the rook's active presence on the c-file immediately pressures black's awkwardly placed king and creates potential threats along the third rank, a quiet but potent demonstration of white's regained initiative after the exchange. Reclaiming the central tension, black re-establishes a pawn presence on the fifth rank, aiming to disrupt white's recently unified rook battery. This maneuver potentially unlocks the d-file for further activity and challenges the newly acquired space white enjoyed. Asserting control over the queenside expanse begins here, aiming to restrict black's bishop's activity and potentially create a passed pawn down the road. Shifting the rook here aims to exploit the open files and create potential mating threats against the exposed white king, while simultaneously offering the chance to simplify into a more favorable rook and pawn endgame by forcing exchanges. Solidifying the pawn structure on the queenside creates a more resilient defense against black's advancing rooks and potential queenside play. Shifting the rook to the third rank initiates a subtle maneuver to potentially exploit the open c-file, aiming to restrict white's queen's mobility and prepare for a coordinated attack on the queenside, perhaps even eyeing a pawn advance down the b-file if the opportunity arises. Seizing the seventh rank offers a clear path to disrupting black's remaining pieces and creating immediate threats. The pawn storm on the queenside, though initially promising to disrupt white's structure, has now become a liability, leaving the king exposed as the rook retreats to defend. Gaining a pawn is appealing, but it leaves your king quite exposed on that open diagonal. The pawn's march forward now unlocks the central diagonal, aiming to activate the king's pawn while simultaneously challenging white's exposed rook on the file, a bold attempt to disrupt the opponent's material advantage. Bringing the rook to the seventh rank dramatically increases its attacking potential, eyeing the isolated pawn and restricting black's pieces. Gaining a pawn is nice, but the rook on the seventh rank is a potent attacking piece, and this decision allows white to keep it there and exert pressure. Unleashing the rook to dominate the d-file, aiming to cut off black's remaining pawns and support the advanced pawn's march. The rook boldly ventures to the fourth rank, a clear signal of black's intent to disrupt white's pawn majority and seek counterplay on the queenside before the opponent can consolidate their material advantage. Snatching the isolated pawn seizes crucial material, but leaves the rook vulnerable and black's own pawns poised to advance. Seizing the open file now, the rook aggressively invades white's territory, aiming to disrupt the pawn structure and create immediate threats. The king ventures out, a bold decision aiming to seize control of the central files and potentially support a pawn push on the kingside, although it does expose itself to potential counterplay along the open diagonals. The rook's maneuver to the b-file targets white's newly acquired queenside pawn, a positional grab that aims to disrupt white's consolidation and potentially force concessions. The rook abandons its valiant defense of the b-file, surrendering the pawn and initiating a desperate chase for the black king. Harnessing the passed pawn's momentum is the core idea now. It aims to break through and disrupt white's coordination. Shifting the king offers a new dimension to the ongoing material struggle, aiming to bolster the king's safety while preparing to potentially activate it later in this pawn-rich endgame. The king's exposed position on the kingside now becomes a primary target for black's pieces. Navigating the king into the heart of the action now secures the pawn majority and prepares for a decisive advance. Unlocking the d-file becomes the primary objective, creating a potential invasion point for the rook and threatening to disrupt white's pawn structure on the queenside. The king ventures out, seeking active participation as the pawn structure collapses. The black king, after a valiant effort to escape its exposed position, now appears to be actively participating in the pawn race, a rather risky endeavor when facing an opponent with a consolidated pawn majority on the queen side. The rook's aggressive sweep checks the king, forcing it to a more exposed position and setting up potential mating nets or further material gains for white. Shifting the king to the edge of the board, a curious defensive maneuver, but potentially allows the rook to dominate the open file and pressure the d-pawn. Bringing the monarch into the fray is a decisive shift, aiming to leverage its newfound mobility to support the pawn advance and perhaps create drawing chances by blockading the passed pawn or defending weakened squares. The black king ventures into the fray, seeking to support its passed pawn, a bold maneuver that could either hasten victory or expose its own vulnerabilities to white's remaining attacking pieces. Consolidating pawns on the king side initiates a methodical buildup towards a potential pawn storm, aiming to create a powerful passed pawn on the g-file and exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king. King's march begins in earnest, forcing the rook into a defensive posture and opening escape routes as the pawn storm gathers momentum. The king bravely steps into the fray, a pivotal moment as it begins its decisive march towards the opposing pawn majority, aiming to escort its remaining pawns to promotion while simultaneously cutting off black's advanced threats. The king's desperate flight across the board now faces a final obstacle, forcing the opponent's monarch into a checkmate position through a precise sequence of checks that leaves no escape squares. Capitalizing on the pawn structure created by the exchange on d3, white aims to solidify the king's central outpost and restrict black's maneuvering space, setting up a potential breakthrough on the king side or a patient buildup towards the endgame. The king's exposed position now invites an immediate threat, opening up potential discovered attacks with the upcoming pawn push. The rook's descent to the 6th rank dramatically intensifies pressure on black's isolated pawns and exposes the king's predicament as a vital defensive piece is withdrawn. Observe the immense pressure building on white's king from that advancing black monarch. Now a mere pawn's leap away from its adversary's royal chamber, signaling a decisive shift towards a king-centric endgame where black holds the initiative. Securing the rook's dominion over the open file, this repositioning aims to restrict the black king's already precarious escape routes and potentially pivot to attack weaker pawns on the queen side. The black king, now exposed in the center after the rook's exchange, becomes a prime target for the remaining white pieces. White's rook, however, will need careful maneuvering to exploit this vulnerability effectively against the isolated passed pawn. Pusher the pawn forward to claim more space. The rook now infiltrates to the 1st rank, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety and potentially create passed pawns on the queen side by forcing the king into an awkward defensive posture. The white king ventures out, seeking to solidify its position and support the advancing pawns, a necessary aggression in this endgame where space is paramount and every tempo counts. Hounding the king across the board, this check forces a difficult choice for white, as the monarch can't escape immediate threats without sacrificing material. King hunt initiated, the royal presence on a6 forces a reckoning with the rook's menacing potential. The king's escape route is now definitively sealed off by the pawn on g3, forcing the rook's pursuit across the entire board to pick off the last vestiges of the enemy's material. The monarch's relocation opens up a direct avenue for its participation in the endgame skirmish. The rook's journey across the board concludes, aiming to reinforce the king's safety and establish a decisive pawn push. The king suddenly finds itself under a spotlight, abandoning its fortress for a perilous exposed position. Suddenly, the rook on Ra1 becomes a pawn hunter, aiming to snatch up that isolated passed pawn and simplify the endgame, though it leaves the king somewhat exposed on that dark square diagonal. The king ventures into the open, an audacious foray into the heart of the endgame's dangers, aiming to exploit any lingering weaknesses on the queen side.